Okay, it's 6:30. I want to get started. And I want to start by telling you I'm Suzanne Wasserman. I'm the director of the Gotham Center. It's so great to have all of you here. Next Wednesday on March 6th in the Siegel Theater, please join us. I hope all of you don't, though, because it only seats 80. Ty Jones' book talk, More Powerful Than Dynamite, Radicals, Plutocrats, Progressives, and New York's Year of Anarchy. On July 4th, 1914, which is just a year later than we're going to start with tonight, a detonation destroyed a 7-story Harlem tenement. It was the largest explosion the city had ever known. Among the dead were 3 bomb makers incited by anarchist Alexander Berkman. They had been preparing to dynamite the estate of John D. Rockefeller Jr., son of the plutocratic dynasty and widely vilified for a massacre of his company's striking workers in Colorado earlier that spring. More Powerful Than Dynamite, which is published by Walker & Company, charts how anarchist anger, progressive idealism, and plutocratic paternalism converged in that July explosion. Its cast ranges from celebrated figures such as Emma Goldman, Upton Sinclair, and Andrew Carnegie, to the fascinating and heretofore little known Frank Tannenbaum, a homeless teenager who dared to lead his followers into the city's churches. Police Inspector Max Schmidberger, too honest for his department and too crooked for everyone else, and Becky Edelson, a young anarchist known for her red tights and for spitting in millionaires' faces. Historian and journalist Ty Jones creates a fascinating portrait of a city on the edges of chaos coming to terms with modernity. So I hope some of you will join us next Wednesday, March 6th, upstairs. Also, because this is such a huge crowd, I'm again going to ask you to be generous and write us a check. It's worked in the past. I'm asking you again. I run these programs without a budget, and it's because of the generosity of our guests, like Sam Roberts, as well as the CUNY Graduate Center, that I can even do this without charging any fees. Also, please buy a copy of Sam's book after the talk, and he'll be happy to sign it. Okay, without further ado, I want to introduce Sam Roberts, who has been the New York Times Urban Affairs correspondent since 2005. Before that, he was deputy editor of the Times Week in Review section, urban affairs columnist, and deputy metropolitan editor. Prior to joining the Times, he worked at the New York Daily News as a reporter, city editor, and political editor. He is the co-author of a biography of Nelson Rockefeller published in 1977, the author of Who We Are, A Portrait of America in 1994 by Times Books, and Who We Are Now in 2004. The Brother, The Untold Story of the Rosenberg Adams Spy Case in 2001, which was a finalist for the National Book Critics Circle Award, and A Kind of Genius in May 2009. An anthology of his podcast entitled Only in New York was also published in 2009. He's the editor of America's Mayor, John V. Lindsay, and the Reinvention of New York, published by Columbia University Press in 2010. He is the host of the New York Times Close-Up, an hour-long weekly news and interview program on New York One, the all-news cable channel produced in association with the New York Times, and which he inaugurated in 1992. A graduate of Cornell University in 1968, he lives in New York. Without further ado, Sam. Thank you.
Thank you, Suzanne. Thanks to the Gotham Center. Thanks to Mike Wallace, who founded the Gotham Center. And thanks to all of you for coming here tonight. One of my frustrations as a daily journalist has always been that we sort of see things happening for the first time when in fact there is almost invariably a context, a perspective, part of a continuum. I think history is very important. I remember in Alan Bennett's play, The History Boys, one of the kids is asked to define history, and he says, more or less, it's just one damn thing after another. Well, that's one way of looking at it. When I wrote a story a couple of years ago on the 400th anniversary of Henry Hudson's visiting New York, I wrote a story about the first recorded murder in New York, which I discovered in the log of the first mate of the ship. And it wound up on the front page of the Times, and my wife said, "Do you know what you've just done? You've turned history into news." And it is news, and that's something that I think we need to appreciate more, and the Gotham Center certainly is in the forefront of appreciating that. At Ed Koch's funeral service a couple of weeks ago, Bill Clinton walked in with a sheaf of papers like this, and he quickly assured the crowd that this was not his speech. He said, "This is not a eulogy. These are just the letters that Ed Koch sent me as president." Well, this is not a eulogy either, because Grand Central doesn't need a eulogy. Thanks to a lot of far-sighted people in the 1970s, the 1980s, the 1990s, and today, Grand Central is probably in better shape than it was back when it began. When I started this book, we agreed on a subtitle. Grand Central publishers like the synergy of doing a book on Grand Central, and they said, okay, how about how a train station transformed America? And I said, sure, sounds good to me. And then I went home and I said, am I really going to be able to deliver on this? Did a train station transform America? Well, I think it really lived up to that billing. It was validated by the research I did for the book, and a lot of the research and a lot of the findings, to me, were surprising, because Grand Central is one of those things we pass through all the time, we kind of take for granted, and yet I found many revelations about the building, about the people who work there. This is a place where you go anywhere in the world and say, this place is like Grand Central Station, and everybody knows what you're talking about. It's sort of controlled chaos, it's frenzy, it's bustle. It has become a simile for that all over the world. Grand Central has been the site of ransom demands, mail train robberies, triumphal homecomings, hope-filled send-offs, the target of Nazi saboteurs, terrorist bombs. Its passengers have included presidents, living and dead. Kids left for summer camp there, and soldiers went to war. Everyone has a Grand Central moment. Ben Cheever, whose father chronicled the suburban commuter, called the terminal as inviting as a rich person's house, with the doors thrown wide open. The concourse is larger than the nave of Notre Dame Cathedral, and yet it is strangely inviting, he wrote. Even as a child on my dismal way to Brooks Brothers, to be fitted for a flannel suit that would chafe the skin off my thighs, I did not feel diminished, he said. Brian Selznick discovered Hugo, the little boy, in his book and film at Grand Central. And my own best memory is, as a kid, probably in the 1950s, we lived in Brooklyn, and my father would take me all over the city. And I remember once standing on a platform at Grand Central, looking up sort of longingly at this gleaming locomotive, when the engineer leaned out and invited me up into the cab and said, "Hey, you want to drive this thing?" And as I remember it, I'd like to think this is close to the truth, he sat me on his lap, placed my hand on the throttle, and the engine chugged forward a couple of feet, but to me it seemed like a mile, driving a locomotive in Grand Central. I keep learning more and more about Grand Central the more book talks I do. In fact, people come up to me afterward and say, "Hey, did you know that so-and-so?" So it is a learning process. That's one of the things I love about working for the New York Times. It's sort of like being paid for a postgraduate education. The Times keeps letting me satisfy my curiosity about all sorts of things. Now, technically, Grand Central is a terminal, but that word conjures up endings when Grand Central is, in fact, and has been a place of new beginnings, not the least of which is its own. It's a terminal because trains terminate there. Railroad people like to recall what is undoubtedly the apocryphal story of the rube who asked a conductor whether his New York Central train stopped at Grand Central, to which the conductor replied, "There'd be an awful crash if it didn't." Well, the fact is that as much as we lament the loss, you could not tell that story about Penn Station, because for all its splendor, one person observed way back, Penn Station reduced New York to a 2-minute stop on the line from Long Island City to Rahway, New Jersey. Now, terminal also suggests a destination. It was the gateway to New York for people from all over the country, and since 1913, it was the city's gateway to the continent. Ask Joan Didion what Grand Central evoked for her. She grew up out of the city. She said, "To those of us who came from places where Grand Central Station was a radio program, New York was no mere city. It was instead an infinitely romantic notion, the mysterious nexus of all love and money and power, the shining and perishable dream itself." And the reason it evoked that image was every Saturday morning on CBS radio, the announcer would intone, "As a bullet seeks its target, shining rails in every part of our great country are aimed at Grand Central Station, heart of the nation's greatest city. Drawn by the magnetic force of the fantastic metropolis, day and night, great trains rush toward the Hudson River, sweep down its eastern bank for 140 miles, flash briefly by the long red row of tenement houses, dive with a roar into the 2.5-mile tunnel, which burrows beneath the glitter and swank of Park Avenue, and then Grand Central Station. Crossroads of a million private lives, gigantic stage on which are played 1,000 dramas daily." Imagine listening to that in a little town anywhere else in the country and what visions you would have of New York City. Grand Central became a cultural icon. It threaded itself into popular culture. Mad Men's Roger Sterling gorged himself on oysters and martinis there. Cary Grant called his mother from a phone booth before fleeing town on the 20th Century Limited in North by Northwest. Animals romped in the main concourse in Madagascar. And Philippe Petit performed his tightrope walk just under the terminal's celestial ceiling. Commercially, Grand Central was one of America's first multi-use buildings. It incorporated shops, restaurants, stores, offices, in short, all the diversity of a city within the confines of one building. Holiday magazine once recalled the exploits, I'm not sure I believe this story, but recalled the exploits of a newly married couple. Their train to Niagara Falls was canceled, so they honeymooned at Grand Central. They got a room at the Biltmore Hotel, linked to the terminal by an underground corridor. They dined, danced, took advantage of the terminal shops and exhibition halls, and did all this without ever once seeing a train. Even more amazing, they returned a year later to celebrate their first anniversary doing the same thing. The first CBS television studio was at Grand Central. It's now a tennis court. But that's where Edward R. Murrow would broadcast, where What's My Line came from, the Goldbergs. And CBS stayed there until people got more sophisticated television sets, and they realized that the vibrations on the screen were not the result of faulty television sets, but from the trains running under the studio. So the CBS TV studio had to move. There were great trains. When you talk about the 20th Century Limited, I mean, it was like going on the Queen Mary, and this was a train trip to Chicago. It was glamorous. We know all about red carpets. They stem from ancient times. But the whole notion, at least in the 20th century, of the red carpet treatment began with the 20th Century Limited. Every night, they would roll out a red carpet down the platform in Grand Central Terminal for the passengers to embark on the 20th Century Limited. Standard time began at Grand Central Terminal in 1883. There were 100 different time zones all over the country. The time depended on when the sun was directly overhead. Everyone said, okay, that's noon, but it meant it was noon in lots of different places at lots of different times. So standard time first was instituted in 1883 at Grand Central. One of the things I learned in doing the book is that the father of modern standard time, Charles Dowd, was later killed. He was run over by a railroad train. There was no indication that I could find whether the train was on time, however. The civil rights movement, something you don't normally associate with Grand Central, was nurtured there. A. Philip Randolph and the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters Union was formed among people who worked at Grand Central. Grand Central was the consummate civic monument, and yet it was even more than that. In 1871, when the original Grand Central was built, the New York Times said, "This place is neither grand nor central. Why would anyone build a railroad station all the way uptown on 42nd Street?" Well, the Vanderbilts managed to deliver Midtown to their doorstep. Grand Central Terminal shifted Manhattan's center of gravity. It's also important for milestones in urban planning and development, things, again, that we take for granted today. You go into Grand Central and you have to walk up and down very, very few steps. And that's because Grand Central moves people, for the most part, not the subway station, but the train part of it, through ramps. And ramps were such an unusual feature at the time when Grand Central opened in 1913 that one magazine had to explain what a ramp was. What is the origin of ramp? And it went all the way back to Julius Caesar, saying that a ramp was those earthworks that were built up to the wall of a city that was under siege so that they could go over the ramparts, and hence the word ramp. Of course, air rights, which again we sort of take for granted now, began at Grand Central Terminal. Park Avenue was decked over, all of that land, 48 acres of an open railroad cut that stretched almost from Lexington to Madison Avenues all the way up to 59th Street, was decked over ultimately and monetized. And of course, while William Wilgus, who was the chief engineer of the New York Central Railroad, his vision for Terminal City was never actually fully realized, the Grand Central Zone, as it's called, is ripe for redevelopment again. Still on our mayor's agenda is a zoning change that would revitalize East Midtown, where more than 80% of the office buildings are more than 50 years old now, but are also, like the Yale Club, the Roosevelt Hotel, the Gray Bar building, part of the city's historic heritage. Landmark preservation really was validated at Grand Central. Paul Goldberger proclaims Grand Central the poster building for every landmark in the United States. Now, one of the things I learned in doing this book that I just had no idea of was that Grand Central began by accident. More specifically, began by an accident. In 1902, a train was coming out of the Park Avenue tunnel from New Rochelle, and it was smoky as usual in the tunnel, sooty, cinders, fog, snow, and it smacked into another train that had come down from Danbury and was waiting to pull into a platform, and ultimately about 24 people were killed. And the Times wrote, "As slowly the harvest of death reaped in the hole under the New York streets is being garnered in the homes of New Rochelle, the townsmen of the dead and the maimed are beginning to ask each other not how this thing occurred, but why." And the how was obvious, and the why was, frankly, negligence on the part of the railroad. The railroad knew that engineers coming out of this tunnel could not see, and the railroad was terror-stricken that it and its officers would be held criminally liable if there were another crash, or even for this one. So William Wilgus, the chief engineer, came up with an idea which, again, we would now take for granted, but in 1902 was fairly revolutionary. It was called electricity. He said, we're going to get rid of the coal-burning locomotives, we are going to electrify the line, at least up into the Bronx, and that will allow us to do two things. It will allow us to build a bi-level station, arrivals and departures, because we don't have to worry about the roof and smoke and soot anymore without coal-burning locomotives, and we can deck over those train yards and produce revenue-generating property, which is exactly what they did. And what they accomplished was to build what became the world's largest rail terminal. 44 platforms accommodating 67 tracks under Grand Central Terminal. And Grand Central is now, when the terminal opened, the Times had a special section and said, someday this place will be able to handle as many as 100 million people. Well, last year it hit 82 million, a record, and it's going to hit that 100 million sooner or later. And of course, when the Long Island Railroad comes in underneath Grand Central, it will become even busier. And Metro North has now overtaken the Long Island Railroad and is the busiest commuter railroad in the country. But this book is not just about bricks and mortar. It's really about people. It's really meant to be Grand Central's biography. It's a story about people from William Wilgus, the prescient chief engineer, Brian Henry, a Metro North cop who befriended the homeless, Audrey Johnson, who fields customers' questions in the information booth. The most frequent, guess what? Where's the men's room? How do I get out of here? Because there's so many labyrinthine passages. And the third, which is a tribute to how subtly the terminal is designed, is where is the Apple store? This is, I think, the biggest Apple store in America, and people standing in the main concourse can't find it because it is so subtly intertwined. And another person who is described fully in the book is, of course, Jacqueline Onassis, who saved the terminal, one could argue, from certain destruction. Why Jackie Onassis? Well, I learned that she had a long history in historic preservation, when Egypt was building the Aswan Dam, the United States government gave money to save a lot of the cultural treasures, the ancient monuments in the Aswan Valley. And as a gift, Egypt said the United States could choose one, and Jackie Onassis, who was then the first lady, Jackie Kennedy, chose the Temple of Dendur. Little did she realize that she would wind up living across the street from the Temple of Dendur on Fifth Avenue. And again, one of the things I learned is that whenever Jackie Onassis had a dinner party, she could call across the street and the Metropolitan Museum would light up the Temple of Dendur for her and her guests. One of those great little New York things, right? I also learned that the terminal is filled with secrets, things, again, that you might not ordinarily notice or wonder why they're secrets at all. You look at this glamorous, majestic, cathedral-like building and say, why does it have bare light bulbs? I mean, could they afford, something a little more elaborate, crystal or some other kind of chandeliers? Well, that was deliberate. That was the Vanderbilts showing off and saying, we have electricity. That behind those globes would not be candles or gas or something else. This was electricity, and that's why to this day you see those bare light bulbs at Grand Central. Interestingly enough, when the MTA decided to switch to more efficient light bulbs, the Landmarks Preservation Commission said, you can't use those twirly light bulbs. I mean, they just don't fit. So they had to go find and specially manufacture round light bulbs that looked more like the original ones, but also were energy efficient. Acorns. You look all over Grand Central, the decorative motif on a lot of the fixtures, a lot of the grill work, acorns. Why acorns? Well, it has nothing to do with squirrels. It turns out that the acorn is on the Vanderbilt family crest. Now, this is a family crest that the Vanderbilts made up because, they don't go back that far. But they made up this crest and acorns, and why did they pick acorns? From little acorns, mighty oaks like the Vanderbilts grow. The ceiling at Grand Central, how many people stop to look up at the ceiling? You're afraid you're going to be run over maybe, but it's a 25,000 square foot ceiling, the constellations in the sky. A couple of days after Grand Central opened, an alert commuter noticed that the constellations were backwards. And they've been trying to figure out ever since exactly how that happened. The most plausible version is that the Columbia astronomer who made the sky chart for the painters thought they would hold it over their head and paint. Instead, they put it down. So what you have is sort of a heavenly down view of the constellations instead of a ground up view. The lesson there is do not use that for navigation. There is a little rectangle in the ceiling, hard to see, but it's in the southwest corner of the ceiling. And it's black. I'm trying to say it's sort of the color of these walls. And why is that there? It was to show before and after what the ceiling looked like before it was cleaned in the 1990s. And when the engineers went up there, they assumed that was the residue of years of coal burning, smoke and cinders and the like, and it turned out to be tar and nicotine from cigarette smoking. And it was very interesting because someone came up to me a couple of weeks ago after I spoke to a group about the book and said, "Did you realize where that rectangle is, this rectangle made of tar and nicotine?" I said, "No." He said, "It's right next to the constellation Cancer." The departure time on the train boards is wrong. All of them. You see that train board that says the 111 is leaving for White Plains? It leaves at 112. Now, if you missed your train, don't blame me. But in fact, they give passengers an extra minute so they can get to their train. One of those great mysteries of the place. Ask someone who owns Grand Central Terminal, and you'd think it's got to be the MTA or Metro North or the state or someone. It turns out it's a guy who's got an office on Fifth Avenue, an investor, the principal in a company called Midtown Trackage Ventures. And he owns Grand Central. He owns the roadbed of 160 miles of track that they bought from the bankrupt Penn Central Railroad. Now, Metro North has an option to buy it in 2018, and even if it doesn't buy it, I don't think we have to worry because the lease runs for another 200 years. But who would think that some individual who never played with electric trains, I discovered, owns Grand Central Terminal? The Whispering Gallery. This, I always thought was one of those urban legends. But if you go just outside the Oyster Bar and stand facing the wall and talk into it in just a whisper like this, not everyone will think you have lost it, but 40 feet on the other side, people could hear exactly what you're saying. No one is quite sure whether Raphael Gustavino designed it that way when he built that ceiling of interlocking tiles, but you could hear very clearly the sound travels over this parabolic curve. It's really one of those remarkable things, and no one is exactly sure who discovered it. But it is funny when you stand there outside the Oyster Bar and see people talking into the wall. Grand Central has the deepest basement in New York. It's 90 feet deep. That's where the alternators are that turn the current from alternating current into direct current. That's the deepest basement, and I never would have imagined that. I would have said the World Trade Center must be deeper, the gold vaults at the Federal Reserve must be deeper, but no, it is 90 feet down under Grand Central. And when the Long Island Railroad mezzanine comes in, that is going to be deeper still. That's going to be 140 feet below street level, about the height or depth of a 14-story building. In The Colossus of New York, Colson Whitehead wrote, "As the earth cooled, Grand Central bubbled up through miles of magna. Lodged in the crust of this island, settled here, the first immigrant, still unassimilated, ever indigestible." And that is how it remains today. That 13-foot diameter clock facing 42nd Street is described as the largest example of Tiffany glass in the world. That, I suspect, may be an urban legend, because Tiffany says they have no record of that, and you think they'd certainly want to. And the limestone sculptures of Minerva, Hercules, and Mercury, which were crafted just across the river in Long Island City, were considered the largest sculptural grouping in the world. Grand Central Terminal has come a long way in 100 years. It's come a long way in 20 or 30 years when you think of where it was in the 1970s and 1980s. Just recently, a building across the street, the Lincoln Building, not a bad name, right? The Lincoln Building, originally named for the former president, was rechristened as Grand Central Place in affirmation of the terminal's cachet and the city's resurgence. The New York Helmsley down the block is now the Westin Grand Central. I mean, imagine a decade or two ago saying, we're going to put the name Grand Central on a hotel or an office building. No way. Metro North estimates that 10,000 people show up at Grand Central every day just to eat. The revenue from retail tenants has quadrupled since 1994. And instead of succumbing to the Penn Central's desperately short-sighted survival strategy, the terminal was reconstituted in the original architect's vision as a grand public space. The architects were Warren and Whitmore and Reed and Stem. I always thought Reed and Stem must have been landscape architects, but they weren't. Reed and Stem, either Reed or Stem was the brother-in-law of William Wilgus, the chief engineer, but Warren and Whitmore trumped that because Whitmore was a cousin of the Vanderbilts. So the two firms came together, and I think one would have to say that the sum of what they did was definitely greater than the individual parts. They created, as Robert A.M. Stern wrote, a convincing expression of the belief that the goals of capitalism are not inimical to the enhancement of the public realm. And if that is so, then the Metropolitan Transportation Authority has squared the circle in demonstrating that the public realm and capitalism can not only coexist, but thrive together. And this at a time when too many people think government is not capable of anything. I'm happy to say that two of the people who deserve some of the credit for this are here tonight. Dick Ravitch, who was head of the MTA and appointed Peter Stengel as head of Metro North, and Beverly Moss Spatt, who was head of the Landmarks Preservation Commission. Grand Central was the product of local politics, bold architecture, brutal flexing of corporate muscle, and visionary engineering. No other building epitomizes the partnership that melded the best instincts of government with public-spirited private investment. There are inevitable comparisons, of course, with Penn Station, and Penn Station did not die in vain. We've got Grand Central because of that. I asked Mike Wallace what was the difference between the two, and he told me that Grand Central was arguably the more transformative of the two stations in the rearrangement of Manhattan's cultural geography. The Central, covered over its tracks, provided an underpinning for the pride of Park Avenue apartments. It provided a haven for New York's super rich. Now, they had sort of been run out of various parts of town over the preceding century, from Washington Square, Union Square, and the Park Avenue apartment buildings provided a stability that they had never known. The establishment of the Upper East Side as a wealthy enclave helped draw hotels, department stores, luxury shops. It channeled commuting managers and professionals from the affluent suburbs back to Midtown every day. This provided an incentive for corporations to relocate in Midtown. It funneled commercial travelers, tourists, which fostered a burst of office and hotel construction, restaurants, theaters. And finally, the terminal itself became a destination. It was a powerful Midtown magnet. Its great soaring concourse, its barrel-vaulted Roman bath, its staircase as grand as the Paris Operas, its ceiling vaster than St. Peter's, the romance of the 20th century limited. They were all crucial factors in shifting the city's cultural and economic center of gravity to its doorstep. In You Can't Go Home Again, Thomas Wolfe wrote this of the late lamented Penn Station. Great slant beams of moted light fell ponderously athwart the station's floor, and the calm voice of time hovered along the walls and the ceiling of that mighty room, a room murmurous with the immense and distant sound of time. Well, today we all know Penn Station, a very different place. Vincent Scully vividly summed up what had been lost. One entered the city like a god, he wrote, one scuttles in now like a rat. Paul Goldberger wrote that Grand Central was never as overpowering or as grandiose as Penn Station was, and that may be why it has survived. It wove its way into the fabric of New York City so subtly and so tightly that it couldn't be ripped out. The real brilliance of the place, he wrote, for all its architectural glory, is the way in which it confirms the virtues of the urban ensemble. Today, the sound of time reverberates in Grand Central, and more than any other place that I can think of, it embodies the voice of the city and the rhythms of urban America. Thank you so much for coming tonight.
Thank you, Sam. That was great. Okay, we're going to sit down, and I'm going to take some questions for Sam. But first, I have a little story I want to tell. Dr. Amanda Dargan, the education director at City Lore, conducted interviews and presented artisans for the Festival of American Folklife of the Smithsonian program Masters of the Building Arts. One of the artisans she interviewed was John Canning, originally from Scotland, whose company, Canning Studios, located in Connecticut, specialized in historic restoration. His company cleaned and restored the interior ceiling of Grand Central Station. When she interviewed him at his studio, he told her this story. He told her that the workmen often write messages in pencil on the ceilings and places that are difficult to see from a distance. As the restorer on such projects, he takes photos of these messages that few people ever see and gives them to the building's owner for their archives. He told her that there were several messages on the Grand Central ceiling. One was written by a man who had worked on an earlier restoration of the ceiling. He wrote next to the Gemini constellation, "Today my child had twins, a boy and a girl." Then he included the date. Amanda Dargan helped present Mr. Canning and his family at the Smithsonian's Folk Festival on the National Mall. And one day, when Mr. Canning had left the site to go have lunch, a man walked up to her and pointed to the photo display of the Grand Central renovation of the ceiling. He said, "My grandfather worked on Grand Central Station. He told me he recorded the date he was born on the ceiling. Were you a twin? Were you a twin?" Dr. Dargan asked. "Yes, how did you know that?" he said. And she told him that John Canning had photographed his grandfather's message. I thought that was an amazing story.
See, as I said, you keep learning things.
Yeah. Okay, so now we will take questions for Sam. Anyone have questions or comments? Yes.
Is it an urban legend or not? I read many years ago that in the bowels of Grand Central, homeless people live there. Is that true or not?
If everyone could hear the question, did or do homeless people live in the bowels of Grand Central? They certainly did. The mole people, as they were called, particularly in the 70s and the 80s, the Coalition for the Homeless, the Grand Central Partnership, each in its own way was instrumental in reducing that number. Metro-North says there may still be some hiding there, but for the most part, that doesn't go on anymore. One of the reasons, frankly, the benches were moved out of what is now Vanderbilt Hall, which used to be the main waiting room, is so that homeless people wouldn't be sleeping on them. And it's interesting, if you walk through, some of the benches are now in the much smaller waiting room near the station master's office. But if you walk through Vanderbilt Hall, you'll notice that the floor, this marble floor, is sort of furrowed. And that's where people were sitting on the benches, sort of, moving, shuffling their feet, waiting for a train. And in 100 years, it wore down the floor. The terminal also closes at night from 2 to about 5:30 in the morning. Another reason for that is not simply to clean it, which that makes much more doable and efficient, but to keep the homeless from staying there overnight.
Yes.
Aha, the baggage car under the Waldorf Astoria. It's important to envision what this train yard looked like. Remember, it stretched all the way from almost Lexington to Madison, all the way up to 59th Street. So there is a siding, among others, under the Waldorf Astoria. That siding, which then was known as Track 63, was indeed used for celebrities to enter and exit the Waldorf Astoria. One of those was Franklin Roosevelt. That's been documented. I actually got hold of the Secret Service logs of his visit to New York to confirm that indeed that was so. That was in part to avoid congestion on the street, in part for security reasons, in part to hide the fact that he was suffering from polio. Whether that baggage car contained his automobile, which also could be lifted up in an elevator into the street level of the Waldorf, is one of those things that is very hard to prove or disprove. Certainly it could have fit in that boxcar, but there's no evidence to say that it actually was in there. One of the things I learned, though, too, which to me was just fascinating, is, all right, that's history, but every time the President of the United States is in New York and stays at the Waldorf, there is a fully manned and running train kept on that track in case of an emergency egress by the President outside of Manhattan. In case for some reason the streets are blocked, in case for some reason there is a chemical or biological attack, you could take the elevator right down to the tracks and scoot out of town on a train.
Yes, in the back. Yeah. Yes.
Who is Campbell?
Campbell Apartment, that great bar. I mean, if you've never been there, just stick your head in the door and see it. Campbell was the head of a company that was a predecessor to Dun & Bradstreet, a credit rating firm. He was also on the board of directors of the New York Central Railroad. And he said, I'd like to have my office at Grand Central. And indeed, there are offices at Grand Central. Sometimes if you stand in the main concourse, you could see people walking through those skyways. Those skyways, one of the ingenious parts of the terminal, because not only do they provide light and air, but they are also corridors that connect various parts of the building. So Campbell had his office there. He did not really live there, even though as a bar it sounds a little bit nicer to call it the Campbell Apartment. But what an office. He imported medieval woodworking from Italy. It's an enormous thing. It has a giant fireplace. It had an organ in it at one point. Campbell lived on Park Avenue and then later in Connecticut. He was a somewhat eccentric man. He insisted upon working at his desk in that office without his pants on because he didn't want them to be wrinkled. So he would take off his pants and hang them up on sort of a pants presser while he was working in the office. We don't know if he ever got up and greeted people when they came to see him, but that was Mr. Campbell.
Yes.
Was Rockefeller Center influenced by Grand Central's design?
Absolutely. Was Rockefeller Center influenced by Grand Central? When you look at the grid in Manhattan, the grid that was presciently designed in 1811, designed from, in effect, 1st Street all the way up to 155th Street, which was bucolic, to say the least. There are very few things that interrupt that grid. One was Grand Central, which was plunked right in the middle of what became Park Avenue, but that whole notion of a city within a city was in effect copied, if you will, or inspired. Grand Central inspired that in terms of Rockefeller Center as well. Very much so, the connecting corridors beneath Rockefeller Center, the different buildings, the multi-use functions, it was definitely modeled after Grand Central to some extent, and Wilgus's original plans for Terminal City, which were intended to have this grand, almost Albert Speer-like civic monument going up Park Avenue. an opera house, other civic institutions. And again, you know, when you look down Park Avenue, there are very few places in Manhattan where you have that kind of a vista. The only other one I could really think of is looking down Fifth Avenue toward Washington Square. But looking down Park Avenue, you look down at what it used to be the New York Central building. General Tire took it over after the New York Central went bankrupt, and they found out that they could save a fortune just by changing the name Central to General. They only had to change, I think, 2 letters, which undoubtedly saved a lot of money. I'm not sure if that's why they bought the building. But it was very funny because when the Penn Central wanted to build a skyscraper over Grand Central, which would have meant demolishing part of the terminal, and this led to the landmarks fight, they said, well, you know, so what? The place has already been ruined by what was then the Pan Am building. And to me, this was a little like a kid who is guilty of parricide, killing his parents, saying, have mercy on me because I'm an orphan, because they built the Pan Am building, and then they were saying, well, you know, the whole place is cheapened because of that, so why don't we just build another building?
Yes.
Can you tell me when the second staircase was built? I understand it wasn't built at the onset. And can you confirm that they painted the windows during World War II?
All right, let's take that chronologically. The windows were painted black during World War II for blackout purposes. So if German bombers were flying overhead, they would not be able to see the city when it was blacked out, and the terminal could stay open. Then it was open pretty much 24 hours a day. It could be lit on the inside, but not give off light. So the skylights and many of the other glass fixtures were painted black. That black was not removed until about 4 decades after World War II. I'm not sure what we were worried about or whether the money wasn't there, but they stayed painted. And the second question was the staircase. Very interesting. When you are restoring a landmark, as Metro North did in the 1990s, what do you do about something that isn't there? They were going to build twin staircases. We have that western staircase. There was supposed to be an eastern staircase in the main concourse. But they said, who is going to go to the east side? There are tenements, there are cow pastures. You know, let's save a little bit of money and not build the staircase. So when John Bell of Beyer Binder Bell and the architect said, you know, we want to restore this to what it looked like originally, there was kind of a fight because how do you define original? So they did go back to the original plans. They did build that staircase. It is almost a twin, and the original one was modeled after the staircase at the Paris Opera House. It is slightly different, and the reason it's slightly different is because it has to comply with the Americans with Disabilities Act. So the risers and the size of the steps are a little bit different than its supposed twin on the other side. They're like fraternal twins.
Yes.
There's a restaurant on Park Avenue and 33rd Street that has the same rounded ceiling.
Yes.
Ceilings and walls.
Wolfgang's. Wolfgang's, you can't hear a thing there. It's sort of like the Whispering Gallery gone amok. Great steak, but very noisy. It's a great place to go with people you don't want to listen to. But that was originally the ballroom or restaurant of the Vanderbilt Hotel, and indeed it was designed by Raphael Gustavino. You could see that design also in Bridge Market under the Queensboro Bridge, what is now a food emporium, and the restaurant space right next to it. It is a beautiful design, and I just discovered, I mean, this is again one of those things you learn the more you talk about this. George McDonald, who is mentioned in the book, the head of the Doe Fund, who was also instrumental in steering the homeless away from Grand Central, just moved into a house in, I think, Bayshore, Long Island, only to discover that this was Raphael Gustavino's house. Meticulously restored, this man who came from Italy and developed this system of interlocking tiles that were vaulted and held up the whole ceiling. Beautiful tile work, but that was part of the Vanderbilt empire for sure.
Ellis Island
hall. It's
There too.
Yes.
As I understood it, $200 million was spent to restore Grand Central. Can you tell me where that money came from and what the revenue generation from restoring was, former stores, and where that money goes to?
The money that was spent on restoring Grand Central, you said $200 million. I frankly don't think anyone knows how much it really was, because a lot of those costs, I think, were sort of hidden away. It was very interesting. When Metro-North said, we want to restore this place, they had no money. This was in the 1980s. So they said, we've got to show people that we can actually accomplish something, that government is capable of doing something. So the first thing they did was remove something instead of build something. They removed the Kodak sign. In any other city, the Kodak sign would probably have been declared a landmark. But here, to save the landmark, we removed the sign. Remember in 1978 when the Supreme Court said, okay, you have the power to declare this a landmark, we are upholding that. Then Metro-North was stuck with it. I mean, you have to preserve the landmark. That's one of the things under the law. It has to be maintained. So they removed the Kodak sign, then they removed that giant West Clocks clock, they removed a Payne-Weber stock brokerage booth in the middle of the main concourse, and then the first thing they did, which was the smartest thing, was repair the roof, because it was leaking. So any other repairs they would have made would have been ruined because the rain would have seeped in from the roof. So I'd say, $100 or $200 million spent on the renovation over 2 or 3 decades is probably a conservative estimate. Where did the money come from? There was a bond issue, if I'm not mistaken. Some of the money came from tax revenue also, and what they did was create a place that they could rent out and generate revenue from through retail, through restaurants. The place was a dump, as we may remember it in the 70s and the 80s. Nobody would want to spend any time there. You would scurry back and forth to a train. You certainly wouldn't go there as a destination to shop or to eat or to sightsee. And they made it into one so that now the revenue that's generated from those stores, from those restaurants, goes back into subsidizing the railroad so they can charge lower fares.
Yes.
Are the chandeliers made of gold?
Are the chandeliers made of gold? I don't think so. I think the chandeliers are brass. One of those urban legends I discovered is that the four-faced clock in the middle of the main concourse, if you look up that clock, go to Google. This is a warning for, taking the web at face value. If you type in the clock and Grand Central, you will find innumerable references to the fact that this clock is valued at $10 to $20 million, that it's made of opal.
Yeah.
In fact, it's not. It's opalescent glass. It is a gorgeous clock. But I went to both Christie's and Sotheby's, who had supposedly appraised the clock. Neither of them ever did. The clock is clearly priceless, but the $10 to $20 million, as best I can tell, is a made-up figure. It is a great clock. It is a great treasure. You ask anyone to meet you at the clock at Grand Central, and they know exactly where to go. And one of the funny things is I met a bunch of people in the course of doing interviews and things for this book. I've met them at the clock, and almost invariably, I've met someone else I know there. And it's sort of like the town square of New York City. I mean, you just run into people.
Yes.
I think there's a library in the railroad station. If this is true, is it open to the public and is it devoted to books on railroading?
There is a group called the Grand Central Railway Enthusiasts, I think it's called. I can get you the exact name. And they do have a library, a little museum. It is not really open to the public, except maybe by appointment. There are not that many railway enthusiasts left. But if you are one of them, if you are a buff, and if you like railroads and books about railroads, I will put you in touch with the person who runs it, and I'm sure he would be delighted to show you around. It's upstairs, sort of just behind the Apple store.
Yes.
Connection to
What is the connection between Grand Central Station, Grand Central Terminal, in fact, and Grand Central Parkway? I don't know of any. Bob Moses built Grand Central Parkway. Maybe he was jealous that he hadn't built the terminal. I don't know. If anyone knows, I welcome. And again, remember, it is a terminal, but there are Grand Central stations. So if, you get stuck in a trivia game one night, you can point out that the original building was called Grand Central Depot in 1871. It was then transformed in 1899 to Grand Central Station. And there still are 2 Grand Central stations in Manhattan, the post office and the subway station.
Yes.
It was near, I believe, was there a movie theater in Grand Central? There was a newsreel theater. And I believe it was right near the Gray Bar Passage on the sort of northeastern part of Grand Central. And what's kind of interesting about that is when Nazi saboteurs landed in Amagansett in, I think, 1941 or 1942, they rendezvoused in the newsreel theater at Grand Central. They caught up, believe it or not, this is one of those things that's sort of too ridiculous to be true. They went to the newsreel theater to catch up on war news. And ultimately, all of them were caught, and several of them were actually executed.
Yes.
I was told once there's a track connecting Grand Central down to Penn Station. Is that true, and is it ever used?
Is there a track connecting Grand Central to Penn Station? Not that I know of, and I cannot imagine why not. There are people in this audience who may be able to explain that to me. But when they were building the Long Island Railroad connection, the so-called East Side access, the tunnel that went down the east side stopped at 38th Street. Needed some room for the trains to park or whatever trains do. The original Grand Central has another great innovation that very few terminals have. There are 2 tracks that loop around, like under 41st Street, 40th Street, so trains can actually turn around. But why they would stop at 38th Street and someone wouldn't say, why did we go down to 34th and make a right, I don't know. Money, of course, had to have been one reason, because tunneling at that depth and that width is obviously very expensive. And it's so expensive that the tunneling machines are just left there because it's too expensive to lift them back up to the surface.
Yes.
I understand there was a rivalry between the Pennsylvania Railroad and New York Central.
Rivalry between the New York Central and the Pennsylvania. They were like the Coke and Pepsi of railroads. They hated each other, and they wasted a lot of money, in fact, competing with each other. The railroads made most of their money actually on freight, not on passenger service. But passenger service was more glamorous, it gave more cachet. So when the New York Central started the 20th Century Limited, the Pennsylvania started the Broadway Limited. And when the New York Central said, hey, we're going to electrify, which means we can deck over Park Avenue, we don't have to worry about smoke and cinders and soot and all of that, the Pennsylvania got something even better out of that deal. The Pennsylvania Railroad went all the way from the West Coast, the Midwest, to New Jersey. The track stopped. You had to take a ferry boat across to Manhattan. Well, electrification meant that they could tunnel under the Hudson River, which they did, built a station on the west side, and then kept tunneling to connect to the Long Island Railroad. So there was definitely a rivalry. In fact, when the New York Central was making its decision to electrify, it was looking over its shoulder and seeing Penn Station being built on the other side of town.
Yes.
Was there ever a poker ring or prostitution at Grand Central?
Undoubtedly.
The ring.
Was there ever a prostitution ring at Grand Central Station? I can't imagine that there wasn't. Detective Burns, who was a famous detective of the New York police force, put together a book of the 100 worst criminals in America. And one of them was a guy I mentioned in the book named Grand Central Pete. who was a con man. He got his name because he hung around Grand Central Terminal and did, among other things, he would, relieve visitors of their money, unsuspecting visitors, by conning them into one thing or another, including buying Grand Central Station.
Yes.
What's the extremes of where you can walk out of Grand Central?
How far can you get to the station by walking out of it? I think you can, I'm not 100% sure you can get to 40th Street, you can certainly get to Lexington, you can get to Madison, and now under, what they call the Northwest Passage, a wonderful description, you can get all the way to about 49th Street, I think 48th or 49th, just walking on platforms under Park Avenue. They do connect. They connect to the Hyatt Hotel. They connect to the Roosevelt Hotel, the Chrysler Building, the Gray Bar Building, a number of other buildings there. Channon Building, yep.
All the way in the back.
The hole in the ceiling. Yes, that's another one of those things that was tough to track down. There is a hole in the ceiling. And everyone told me the hole was there because in 1957, when we were worried about Russian advances into space and the development of Sputnik, America wanted to show off that, hey, we're not too far behind. So the Chrysler Corporation brought in by rail, a Redstone missile to display in the middle of Grand Central Terminal. Well, I found out the dimensions of the missile, and they clearly did not reach the roof. So I'm trying to figure out, well, how could it be that there's a hole in the roof because of the Redstone missile? Well, upon further determination, there was a cable attached to the missile to keep it from tipping over and falling on railroad passengers in the middle of the terminal. And it was that cable for which they made a hole. For reasons that are not entirely clear, they kept the hole. And I'm not sure how many of you saw the film with Jeff Daniels, The House on Carroll Street. It is not a bad spy movie, but it is worth watching just for the climactic chase scene through the attic of Grand Central Terminal. And part of that scene was filmed through that hole that still stays in the ceiling of Grand Central.
Interesting.
Yes, I can point to it. It's sort of midway north and east in the sky, but I'm not sure in which constellation. Pisces? Yes, Pisces. If I had read the book again, I would have known that. I said there was something fishy about that, though.
Jerry?
Do you have a favorite story or two about the oyster bar?
A favorite story about the Oyster Bar. The Oyster Bar is the original tenant in Grand Central. When you look back at how many different restaurant stores have been there over the years, the Oyster Bar was there when the terminal opened in 1913. And it was interesting because there was a restaurant concessionaire, I forget the name that is in the book, that had been in the old station. And they offered this space to him. And he said, no, I don't want to go there. No one is going to go in the basement to eat. So whoever opened the Oyster Bar managed to keep the place open for 100 years, and it's still there. It is, again, a place that's a little bit hard to hear in because of that Gustavino ceiling, but great food and great biscuits. My favorite thing at Grand Central is to stand on one of the balconies and look down at the people on the main concourse. And it's like this urban ballet. It's this sort of choreographed chaos. And I have to say, in all the time I've spent doing that, I don't think I've ever seen anyone bump into someone else. It's just one of those remarkable things, maybe like bats with sonar or something. But people just manage to walk around each other. There are people standing in the middle of the concourse having a conversation or taking pictures of the ceiling or whatever they may be doing, and nobody bumps into each other.
Mm-hmm. Yes, all the way in the back.
If you enter from the Lexington Avenue side and look up, there's sculpted
There are rats. Why are there sculpted rats at the Gray Bar building? Exactly why they're there, I'm not sure. But what those are, there is an awning at the Gray Bar building on the Lexington Avenue side, and there is a representation of ropes holding the awning up. Ropes like they have on a ship. And I forget those little cup things they have at the end of the rope to keep rats from running up the ship. There's a name for them that I guess I should know. But there are sculpted rats. It has to be the only building, at least in New York, that is decorated with rats. But there they are. There are 3 or 4 rats climbing up those little ropes that you could see from outside on Lexington Avenue. Absolutely a true story.
Yes.
Oh, there's also something else interesting. When you take that Gray Bar passage, there is a clock as you're walking to the main concourse, and it is a clock that says in big letters under it, Eastern Standard Time, because the railroad was boasting about the fact that Eastern Standard Time started at Grand Central Terminal. The problem is nowadays, of course, with that Eastern Standard Time carved in marble, the sign is wrong about half the year.
All the way in the back? Yes.
I'm sorry, I couldn't hear. Tennis, yes, there is a tennis court. There was there. I took tennis lessons there also, and it didn't help. You could never lob the ball because it would wind up going into the rafters, but there's now a very fancy and fairly pricey tennis court where the old CBS studios were. And there are 4 banks of elevators in each corner of the main concourse, and one of them, I think it is the southeast, actually leads up to the tennis courts.
Yes, all the way in the back.
Yeah, in the Gray Bar passage, one of these ceiling vaults is painted. It keeps getting damaged by the rain. At one time, were many of them painted like that? And I wanted to tell you about the Lincoln Building. But first, answer that one.
The Gray Bar painting, I don't think there were murals in many of the other passageways. There was that mural in Gray Bar building, a beautiful mural, and I think it has occasionally been restored.
Okay, let me tell you about one of these things that a couple of years ago I was walking through and I noticed the bust of the statue of Lincoln was missing from the Lincoln Building. So I went to the rental agent of the building and I complained, what are you changing the name to? 1 Grand Central Plaza, whatever 16 East is called. And he said, the name of this building was never the Lincoln Building. It wasn't named after the President Lincoln. It was named after a company called the Lincoln Company. That put their name like the Fuller Building.
Half true. Half true. The Lincoln Building was named after a building that had been on the site, which I think was the Lincoln Bank, which may in turn have been named after a warehouse company called the Lincoln Warehouse, which was named after Lincoln. And the bust, the statue that was in the lobby was actually the model for the statue of Lincoln that is in the Lincoln Memorial in Washington. It is the same sculpture, the one in Washington, obviously a bigger version of that.
Yes.
Hi, the family Vanderbilts were in the shipping business, as I understand it. Thus, Commodore Vanderbilt and the rats.
I'm not sure about the rats, but the Commodore certainly stems from the shipping business. He operated a ferry from Staten Island. I'm not sure if that alone qualifies you as a Commodore, but he did expand to boats going up and down the Hudson and ultimately enough of a fleet, so I guess Commodore is justified. The rats may have been some ship motif associated with the Commodore too.
Yes.
A lot of people thought he was a rat. He was not a pleasant person.
I just want to say that many of us have read your articles for 45 years and really enjoyed them. Didn't know you were such a great speaker, but also you have done a landmark presentation, great service by writing this book.
Thank you.
I think we'll take one or two more questions, and then we'll have you buy the book and have Sam sign it. So yes, yeah.
Red leather Japanese guy with the glasses and the alfalfa mohawk. Do you know anything about him?
I must have missed him.
One more final question. Yes.
I understand that during the restoration in the 1990s, a series of lamps were stolen by one of the contractors, and subsequently you put them up on eBay for sale.
That is true. Were a bunch of lamps, a bunch of light fixtures stolen by employees of some of the contractors during the renovation. They were then put up for sale on eBay, pretty stupid, because they were tracked down and retrieved, and I think the person who stole them was prosecuted, if I believe correctly. They were not the lamps in the former main waiting room, those giant fixtures. They were much smaller ones that you could cart out, but they were still very valuable. And again, given what they were made of and given the original design and given that they were 100 years old, they were priceless.
Thank you so much.